Becoming an adult, physical, cognitive, and personality development in young adulthood. So there are four objectives. First one, 10.1, emerging adulthood. 10.2, physical development and health. 10.3, cognitive development. And 10.4, who do you want to be? Personality in young adulthood. So this is the introduction. There comes a time in life when we turn away from childhood and aspire to being adults. In some societies, the transition to adulthood is abrupt and dramatic, marked by clear rites of passage. In Western society, it is fuzzier. The only apparent marker may be a birthday ritual. We may even ask real adults what it's like to be one. Adulthood is marked in numerous ways, some of which we'll explore in this first section. Without question, young adulthood is the peak of physical process and health. It is also a time when people who acquired unhealthy habits earlier in life may decide to adopt a healthier lifestyle. Young adulthood also marks the peak of some cognitive abilities and the continued development of others. On a more personal level, young adulthood is a time when we make plans and dream of what lies ahead. It is a time when we think about what life as an adult will be like. But above all, it is a time when we lay the foundation for the developmental changes that we'll experience during the rest of our lives. We will consider these issues as we examine young adulthood in this chapter. (10.1) Emerging Adulthood. Learning Objectives. What role transitions mark entry into adulthood? How does going to college reflect the transition to adulthood? What behavioral criteria mark the transition to adulthood? How does achieving financial independence reflect the transition to adulthood? When do people become adults? Marcus woke up with the worst headache he could ever remember having. If this is adulthood, they can keep it, he muttered to himself. Like many young adults in the United States, Marcus spent his 21st birthday celebrating at a bar. But the phone call from his mother that woke him in the first place reminds him that he isn't an adult in every way. She called to see if he needs money. Think for a minute about the first time you felt like an adult. When was it? What was the context? Who were you with? How did you feel? Even though becoming an adult is one of the most important life transitions, it is difficult to pin down exactly when this occurs in Western societies. Birthday celebrations marking the achievement of a certain age are inconsistent in their message. In the United States, for example, the age needed to achieve, quote, adult status ranges from 12 or so for movie theater tickets to 16 for driving in many states, 18 for voting and joining the military, 21 for consuming alcoholic beverages, 24 for dependent status as a full-time student according to the IRS, 25 for renting a car without expensive subcharges, and 26 for medical insurance coverage on one's parents' policy under the 2010 healthcare law. Clearly, in the United States, there is no age that signals a clean break with adolescence and full achievement of adulthood. Certainly, Marcus may feel like an adult because he can purchase alcohol legally, but he may not feel that way in other respects, such as supporting himself financially. Some human developmentalists view the period from late teens to mid to late 20s as distinctive. They refer to it as emerging adulthood, as a period when individuals are not adolescents but are not yet fully adults. Emerging adulthood is a time to explore careers, self-identity, and commitments. It is also a time when certain biological and physiological developmental trends peak. Brain development continues in different ways, and the risk for certain mental health problems peaks. In this section, we'll examine some of the ways societies mark the transition to adulthood, and we'll see that the criteria vary widely from culture to culture. Role transitions marking adulthood. Consider the following three women. Ganika looked older than her 20 years. Her son was playing quietly on the floor. She and her husband live in a small house in a village in rural India. Sheree graduated from high school a few years ago. She works full-time at the Old Navy store and rents a small apartment nearby. Claudia recently graduated from college in Germany, but due to an economic downturn, she lives with her mother while she looks for a job. Are these women adults? Yes and no. As we will see, it all depends on how you define adulthood and the kind of role transitions cultures create. A role transition is a movement into the next stage of development marked by assumption of new responsibilities and duties. Cross-cultural evidence for role transitions. Cultures in the developing world tend to be clear about when a person becomes an adult and to put greater emphasis on specific practices that mark the transition. Rituals marking initiation into adulthood, often among the most important ones in a culture, are termed rites of passage. Rites of passage may involve highly elaborate steps that take days or weeks, or they may be compressed into a few minutes. Initiates are usually dressed in apparel reserved for the ritual to denote their special position. We still have traces of these rites in Western culture. Consider, for example, the ritual attire for graduations or weddings. In many cultures, rites of passage to adulthood are connected to religious rituals. For example, Christian traditions use a ritual called confirmation to mark the transition from being a child spiritually to being an adult. Judaism celebrates bar and bar mitzvahs. In many Latin American countries, a girl's 15th birthday is celebrated as a transition between childhood and young womanhood. In some countries, this ceremony, called a quinceañera, is preceded by a mass if the girl's family is Catholic. Marriage is the most important rite of passage to adulthood in most cultures because it is a prelude to childbearing, which in turn provides clear evidence of achieving adulthood. In this sense, Ganika is an adult in her culture. Some tribal cultures mark the transition to adulthood in public ways so that the whole community witnesses it. In a few cultures, it may involve pain or mutilation, such as female circumcision, or may involve being given a specific tattoo. Because rites in such cultures change little over time, they provide continuity throughout the lifespan. Older adults lead young people through the same rites they themselves experienced years earlier. Western counterparts are much less formalized and are hard to identify. Indeed, you may be hard-pressed to think of any. A father buying his son his first razor, or a mother helping her daughter with her first menstrual period may be as close as we get in Western society. Role transitions in Western cultures. In Western cultures, the most widely used criteria for deciding whether a person has reached adulthood are role transitions, which involve assuming new responsibilities and duties. Certain role transitions have long been recognized in Western society as key markers for attaining adulthood: voting, completing education, beginning full-time employment, leaving home and establishing an independent household, being financially independent, getting married, and becoming a parent. However, many people in their 20s in industrialized countries spread these achievements over several years, and this trend has significantly increased since the late 1970s. The result is a period some researchers call, quote, emerging adulthood. The point in the lifespan when the marker events for role transitions happen through has changed a lot over the years. Such changes are examples of cohort effects described in Chapter 1. For example, in the United States, the average age for completing all of one's formal schooling rose steadily during the 20th century as proportion of people going to college at some point in adulthood increased from roughly 10% in the early part of the century to roughly 2/3 today. Likewise, since the early 1970s, the age at first marriage has increased in the United States by almost 5 years. A remarkable change within one generation. What does this mean for the transition from adolescence to adulthood? It means that Western society has no clear age-consistent rituals that clearly mark the transition to adulthood. As a result, young people create their own, such as initiations into student organizations or drinking alcohol, a topic we explore later in this chapter. The lack of clearly defined rituals makes it difficult to use any one event as the marker for becoming an adult. Although the trend is that living independently from one's parents, financial independence, and romantic involvement are associated with increased assumption of adult roles, individual patterns are extremely diverse. So, depending on how you look at it, Sheree and Claudia may or may not be considered adults. Let's consider some of the components of the role transitions in Western culture and how they help shape role transitions. First, let's consider a common one for many people, the move from high school to college. Going to college. For about 69% of all high school graduates in the United States, a marker of transition to adulthood is going straight to college, although the rates vary across European Americans, African Americans, and Latinos, as shown in the figure. Considerable research has documented how students develop while they are in college. Students start acting and thinking like adults because of advances in intellectual development and personal social identity. It is thought that much of the developmental change in college occurs through social interaction. Indeed, there is a belief that the college social experience can either facilitate or frustrate the development of one's sense of identity, including ethnic racial identity. Later in the chapter, we will examine some of the cognitive changes that occur during the transition from adolescence to adulthood. Those changes may well describe the experience of those who go directly from high school to college. But take a look around, literally at your classmates. In addition to their increased ethnic and racial diversity, you see the age diversity you also likely experience is a reflection of the rapidly changing nature of college and university campuses. Although students who attend college full-time tend to be traditional age, which is under 25 years. As you can see in the figure, a relatively large number of undergraduates are older, with most of them attending part-time. Colleges usually refer to students over age 25 as returning adult students, which implies that these individuals have already reached adulthood. Overall, returning adult students tend to be problem solvers, self-directed, pragmatic, may have increased stress due to work, family, school conflict, and have relevant life experiences that they can integrate with their coursework. Balancing employment and families along with their college courses often causes stress, especially early in returning adult students' academic studies. However, support from family and employers, as well as the positive effects of continuing one's education, are stress reducers. But many returning adult students, especially middle-aged women, experience a sense of self-discovery they had not experienced before. We'll encounter more about returning adult students later in this chapter. The main conclusion here is that going to college has a major impact on students of all ages. For traditional age students, age 18 to 25, it helps foster the transition to adulthood. Whether or not college students succeed is heavily influenced by their environment they experience. For example, colleges and universities that consider student success everyone's responsibility, the students, faculty, and staff alike are more likely to create a supportive culture that fosters students' developmental progress. Having positive psychological well-being is another important component. Behavioral changes. From a psychological perspective, becoming an adult means interacting with the world in a fundamentally different way. Cognitively, young adults think in different ways than do adolescents. We will consider this developmental change later in this chapter in section 10.3. Behaviorally, between adolescence and middle age, there is a significant drop in the frequency of risky behaviors such as driving at high speed, having sex without contraception, engaging in extreme sports, or committing antisocial acts like vandalism. The desire to live life more on the edge through physically and emotionally threatening situations on the boundary between life and death is termed edge work. Managing to deal with intense emotions when faced with real danger is a delicate balance, and how men and women accomplish this differs. For example, in thinking about or planning future dangerous activities, men tend to be highly confident in their ability to extricate themselves from tough positions and do not feel a need to rehearse just in case. Women, though, are more likely to have qualms which they ease by rehearsing. Evidence from neuroscience research has raised an intriguing question. Could continuing brain development during adolescence and early adulthood explain shifts in behavior and document a biological marker for adulthood? Some investigators think so. There is evidence that the prefrontal cortex, a part of the brain involved in high-level thinking, is not fully developed until a person reaches his her mid-20s. That has led to the speculation that the risky behavior demonstrated by adolescents and people in their early to mid-20s is a function of both the fact that the brain is not yet fully developed and the social environment in which the person lives. Males argues that a closer look at the evidence indicates that this brain development hypothesis is wrong. He shows that risk-taking behavior does not vary with age between young and middle-aged adults when socio-demographic conditions such as poverty are controlled. That is, poverty is a stronger correlate of risky behavior than is brain development. Similarly, Burns and colleagues report that the neurological data do not support the idea that risky behavior is caused mainly by immature brains. On the psychosocial front, young adulthood marks the transition from concern with identity to concern with behavior related to autonomy and intimacy, which we explore here in Chapter 11. Becoming independent from one's parents entails being able to fend for oneself, but it does not imply a complete severing of the relationship. On the contrary, adult children usually establish a rewarding relationship with their parents, as we will see in Chapter 13. Establishing intimacy. According to Erikson, the major task of young adults is dealing with the psychosocial conflict of intimacy versus isolation. This is the sixth step in Erikson's theory of psychosocial development, the basic tenets of which are summarized in Chapter 1. Once a person's identity is established, Erikson believed that he or she is ready to create a shared identity with another, the key ingredient for intimacy. Without a clear sense of identity, Erikson argued, young adults would be afraid of committing to a long-term relationship with another person or might become overly dependent on their partner for his or her identity. Some studies support this view. For example, Montgomery found that a stronger sense of identity was related to higher levels of intimacy in young adults. However, other research shows differing results. For example, Berliner also found that identity formation correlated with intimacy in adults aged 35 to 45, but this relationship held even for those people who demonstrated diffusion, the lowest level of identity formation, which Erikson argued should not be the case. A meta-analytic study of the connection between identity and intimacy provides insight into why findings in individual studies are inconsistent. After analyzing the results of 21 studies, Arseth and colleagues concluded that resolving identity issues before intimacy issues differed between men and women. The differences are complex. At a general level, identity is related to closeness in same-sex friendships for both men and women, and also for men in cross-sex friendships. For women, however, identity is unrelated to closeness in cross-sex friendships. Why is there a difference in cross-sex friendships patterns? It turns out that most men in career-oriented women resolve identity issues before intimacy issues. So these individuals sort through their initial career choices and complete their formal education before becoming involved in a committed relationship. But some women resolve intimacy issues before identity issues by marrying and rearing children, and only after their children have grown and moved away do they deal with the question of their own identity. The experience of self-discovery by middle-aged women who go to college for the first time is an example of this form of identity development. Still other women deal with both identity and intimacy issues simultaneously, for example, by entering into relationships that allow them to develop identities based on caring for others. For example, if a woman partner has special health or medical treatment needs, the woman could develop a strong identity as a caregiver and a strong intimate relationship with the partner simultaneously. Thus, Erikson's idea that identity must be resolved before intimacy is most applicable in cases of men and career-oriented women. The fact that some women show different patterns yet still resolve both issues indicate that there are likely multiple pathways to achieving identity and intimacy. Launching one's financial independence. For many, the key indicator of becoming an adult is launching one's career, establishing financial independence. For 1/3 of high school graduates who do not go on to college, and for those who do not finish high school, establishing financial independence may be a more pressing issue sooner than it is for college-bound students. Some find their niche through a series of part-time jobs, full-time employment, learning a trade such as carpentry or plumbing, or starting their own business. Others join the military, a pathway to adulthood created as a result of the all-volunteer service. Military service paves a way to adulthood in several ways, not the least of which is through financial independence. The support services in the military can also foster a level of maturity in family and social relationships. The military also provides a stable career option, especially considering that the military will provide advanced educational opportunities that may not be available otherwise. Eventually, though, even college-bound students face the need to establish themselves as financially independent. When this happens, though, is changing. These days, it is increasingly common for college graduates to return home to live with their parents prior to establishing financial independence. We will consider what happens when adult children return home in Chapter 13. Regardless of when it occurs, though, reaching financial independence is a major achievement and serves as a marker of becoming an adult, and where one lives matters in the process. The research of Western culture shows clearly that living on one's own accelerates the achievement of adulthood, whereas living with one's parents slows the process of becoming an independent adult. So, when do people become adults? Increasingly, researchers and writers are arguing that the years between late adolescence and the late 20s to early 30s may reflect a distinct life stage researchers call emerging adulthood. Evidence is mounting that social and demographic trends since the 1970s may be creating a new developmental period, much as similar changing circumstances created the period of adolescence in the early 20th century. The changes faced by adults in their 20s can be difficult. Robbins and Wilner coined the term quarter-life crisis to describe the life in one's 20s is far from easy as individuals struggle to find their way. Adjusting to the, quote, real world is increasingly difficult for college graduates who face significant debt from educational loans, as well as challenges from workplace politics, networking, time management, and other daily hassles. Indeed, Bioch argues with quarter life today serves a similar purpose to midlife 50 years ago. For Bioch, quarter life represents a period of self-exploration and search for meaning in a way similar to the way Jung described the search for meaning in his original theory of the midlife crisis, a topic we will explore more in Chapter 13. The perspectives considered in this section do not provide any definitive answers to the questions of when people become adults. All we can say is that the transition depends on numerous cultural and psychological factors. In cultures without clearly defined rites of passage, defining oneself as an adult rests on one's perception of whether personally relevant key criteria have been met. In Western society, this can be very complicated. For example, when success comes at a young age, as discussed in the Real People feature. All right. This is section 10.2, Physical Development and Health, Learning Objectives. In what respects are young adults at their physical peak? How healthy are young adults in general? How do smoking, drinking alcohol, and nutrition affect young adults' health? How does health of young adults differ as a function of socioeconomic status, gender, and ethnicity? Juan is a 25-year-old who started smoking cigarettes in high school to be popular. Juan wants to quit, but he knows it will be difficult. He has also heard that it doesn't really matter if he quits or not because his health will never recover. Juan wonders whether it is worthwhile to try. Juan is at the peak of his physical functioning. Most young adults are in the best physical shape of their lives. Indeed, the early 20s are the best years for strenuous work, trouble-free reproduction, and peak athletic performance. These achievements reflect a physical system at its peak. but people's physical functioning is affected by several health-related behaviors, including smoking. Growth, strength, and physical functioning. Physical functioning generally peaks during young adulthood. You're as tall as you will ever be. You'll likely get shorter in later life, as described in chapter 14. Although men have more muscle mass and tend to be stronger than women, physical strength in both sexes peak during the late 20s and early 30s, declining slowly throughout the rest of life. Coordination and dexterity peak around the same time. Because of these trends, few professional athletes remain at the top of their sport in their mid-30s. Indeed, individuals such as Brett Favre, a quarterback who played in the NFL into his early 40s, and Dara Torres, who set the record for the oldest swimmer to win Olympic medals by winning 3 in Beijing in 2008 at age 41, are famous partly because they are exceptions. Because they are at their physical peak, most professional sports stars are in their 20s. Sensory acuity is also at its peak in the early 20s. Visual acuity remains high until middle age, when people tend to become farsighted and require glasses for reading. Hearing begins to decline somewhat by the late 20s, especially for high-pitched tones. By old age, this hearing loss may affect one's ability to understand speech. People's abilities to smell, taste, feel pain, and changes in temperature and maintain balance remain largely unchanged until late life. Health status. When adults aged 18 to 44 in the United States are asked how good their health is, 94% say that it is good, very good, or excellent. Young adults have far fewer colds and respiratory infections than when they were children. Indeed, only about 1% of young adults are limited in their ability to function because of health-related conditions. Because they are so healthy overall, American young adults very rarely die from disease. For example, the death rate due to cancer for people aged 15 to 24 is about 4 people per 100,000 population, compared with 116 per 100,000 for people aged 45 to 54, and more than 1,606 per 100,000 for people over age 85. So, what is the leading cause of death among young adults in the United States? Between the ages of 25 and 44, it's accidents. There are important gender and ethnic differences in these statistics. Young adult men aged 25 to 34 are nearly 2.5 times as likely to die as women of the same age. African American and Latino young adult males are 2 to 2.5 times as likely to die as adult males are likely to die, at only half the rate of their European American male counterparts. Lifestyle factors. To maximize the odds of being healthy, don't smoke, monitor your alcohol consumption, and eat a well-balanced nutritional diet. In this section, we focus on why this is good advice. We return to this theme in chapter 13 when we examine additional aspects of health promotion, especially concerning cardiovascular disease and exercise. Smoking. Smoking is the single biggest contributor to health problems, a fact known for decades. In the United States alone, roughly 400,000 people die each year of smoking-related illnesses, and medical treatment of smoking-related ailments costs more than $193 billion annually. The risks of smoking are many. In the figure, it shows the various forms of cancer and other chronic diseases that are caused by smoking. As noted in Chapter 2, nicotine in cigarettes is a potent teratogen. Smoking during pregnancy can cause stillbirth, low birth weight, or perinatal death shortly after birth. And smoking during one's lifetime has a small but measurable negative impact on cognitive functioning in later life. Non-smokers who breathe secondhand smoke are also considerably higher risk for smoking-related diseases. Each year, more than 3,400 adult non-smokers die from lung cancer, and 46,000 adult non-smokers die from cardiovascular disease. Hundreds of thousands of children suffer from lung problems annually in the United States as a result of environmental smoke. And it costs about $10 billion in healthcare. For these reasons, many states and communities have passed stricter legislation banning smoking in public buildings and public outdoor spaces, and smoking is banned entirely on airline flights within the United States and on many international flights. Still, secondhand smoke remains a major problem. About 40% of non-smokers in the United States continue to be exposed to secondhand smoke. Juan, the young man in the vignette, is typical of people who want to stop smoking. Most people who try to stop smoking begin the process in young adulthood. Although some smokers who want to quit find formal programs helpful, more than 90% of those who stop do so on their own. But as Juan suspects, quitting is not easy. The American Cancer Society estimates that even with medicinal intervention, between 2/3 and 3/4 of those who try to quit smoking end up starting again within 6 months. For most people, success is attained only after long periods of stopping and relapsing. Regardless of how it happens, quitting smoking has enormous health benefits both for smokers and for people who inhale secondhand smoke. For example, in less than a year after quitting, the lungs regain their normal ability to move mucus out. The risks of stroke and coronary heart disease return to normal after a period of roughly 15 years. Even people who do not quit until late life show marked improvements in health. In sum, the evidence is clear. If you don't smoke, don't start. If you do, you're never too old to stop. Check out the American Cancer Society's Guide to Quitting Smoking for key information about how to quit and a quiz about whether you need to help to quit. Drinking alcohol. If you are between the ages of 18 and 44, chances are that you sometimes drink. About 2/3 of people in the United States drink alcohol at least occasionally. Total consumption of alcohol in industrialized countries has declined for the past few decades, and underage drinking in the United States has also declined, partly in response to tougher laws regarding underage drinking and driving while intoxicated. For the majority of people, drinking alcohol poses no serious health problems as long as they do not drink and drive. In fact, numerous studies show that for people who drink no more than 2 glasses of wine per day, alcohol consumption may be beneficial. For example, moderate drinkers, 1 or 2 glasses of beer or wine per day for men, 1 per day for women, have 25 to 40% reduction in the risk of cardiovascular disease and stroke than either abstainers or heavy drinkers, even after controlling for hypertension, prior heart attack, and other medical conditions. For many students, college parties and drinking alcohol are virtually synonymous. Indeed, campuses in the United States are even rated in terms of the level to which students have the reputation for, quote, partying. Unfortunately, drinking among college students often goes beyond moderate intake to become binge drinking. Binge drinking is defined for men as consuming 5 or more drinks in a row, and for women as consuming 4 or more drinks in a row within the past 2 weeks. Binge drinking has been identified as a major health problem in the United States since the 1990s. Surveys of drinking behavior among young adults consistently show that the rate of binge drinking in the general young adult population has declined, but the rate among college students has not. Although students between the ages of 17 and 23 are more likely than older students to binge drink, there is no relation between year in school and binge drinking rates. So, which students are most likely to binge drink? You are significantly more likely to binge drink if alcohol is readily available, if you are a member of a fraternity or sorority, or if you feel really positively about what you are doing, which tends to make some people behave rashly. Other predictors include being male, European American, or of middle or higher socioeconomic status, having used other drugs in the past 30 days, believing that drinking will help you socially, believing there is minimal risk from drinking, believing that friends do not disapprove of binge drinking, and believing that high levels of drinking are normal. Recent research indicates that average binge drinking among college students is an international problem, with rates in Europe, South America, Australia, and New Zealand roughly on par with the United States. The notion that binge drinking is just innocent fun is simply wrong. Driving under the influence among binge drinkers ups significantly since the late 1990s to nearly 3 million students per year in the United States is only one aspect. Nearly 100,000 college students annually are victims of alcohol-related date rape, and nearly 700,000 are assaulted by a student who has been drinking. Although no national data are routinely collected regarding alcohol poisoning, researchers estimate that about 1,700 young adult college students aged 18 to 24 die every year in the United States from drinking alcohol too much. No question about it, binge drinking is extremely dangerous. As you can see in the figure, the rate of drinking-related problems, including missing class and engaging in unwanted sexual behavior, is much higher in binge drinkers, especially those who binge drink 3 or 4 times within a 2-week period. Quote, frequent binge drinkers. These problems have an important, long-lasting consequences that range from poor grades and unplanned pregnancies to contracting STDs. Numerous programs aim to reduce the number of college students who binge. These efforts include establishing low tolerance levels for the antisocial behaviors associated with binge drinking, working with athletes, fraternities, and sororities, changing the expectations of incoming freshmen, and increasing the number of non-alcoholic activities available to students. As discussed in the What Do You Think feature, these efforts come at a time when national and international attention is directed at the problem. In the United States, nearly 8% of adults 18 to 24 years old and 5% of those aged 25 to 44 are considered heavy drinkers. However, significantly more men than women are alcohol dependent or experience alcohol-related problems. Rates are also higher for European Americans and Native Americans than other ethnic groups. Alcoholism is viewed by most experts as a form of addiction, which means that alcoholics demonstrate physical dependence on alcohol and experience withdrawal symptoms when they do not drink. Dependence occurs when a drug such as alcohol becomes so incorporated into the functioning of the body's cells that the drug becomes necessary for normal functioning. Why does alcohol affect how we think, feel, and behave so profoundly? Neuroscience research has discovered that alcohol does a number on our brain, especially in disrupting the balance in neurotransmitters. These neurotransmitters include GABA, which inhibits impulsiveness, glutamate, which excites the nervous system, norepinephrine, which is released in response to stress, and dopamine, serotonin, and opioid peptides, which are responsible for pleasurable feelings. Excessive long-term drinking can deplete or increase the levels of some of these neurotransmitters, causing the body to crave alcohol to restore good feelings or to avoid negative feelings. Additionally, other factors come into play: genetics, high stress, anxiety or emotional pain, close friends or partners who drink excessively, and sociocultural factors that glorify alcohol. Treating addictions such as alcoholism is difficult. Most people seeking treatment for alcohol abuse or dependence for the first time are young adults. The most widely known treatment option is Alcoholics Anonymous, which was founded in Akron, Ohio in 1935 by two recovering alcoholics. Other treatment approaches include inpatient and outpatient programs at treatment centers, certain medications, and various forms of counseling. Typically, the goal of these approaches is abstinence. Unfortunately, we know very little about the long-term success of various programs. What we do know is that there are multiple options that can be successful, and that which approach will work with which individual is not very predictable. Nutrition. How many times were you told to eat your vegetables? Or that, quote, you are what you eat? Most people have disagreements with parents about food while growing up, but as adults, they later realize that those lima beans and other despised foods are really healthful, and don't taste bad as we once thought. Experts agree that nutrition directly affects one's mental, emotional, and physical functioning. Diet has been linked to cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, anemia, and digestive disorders. As people mature, their nutritional requirements and eating habits change. This change is due mainly to differences in metabolism, or how much energy the body needs. Body metabolism and the digestive process slow down with age. The USDA publishes guidelines to help people create healthy diets. In 2011, the USDA launched the ChooseMyPlate.gov campaign that provides a visual guide to healthy eating by showing the relative proportions of various types of food people should eat daily, shown in the figure. The guidelines emphasize eating less, making half of the food of one's plate fruits and vegetables, making half of the grains eaten be whole grains, switching to fat-free or low-fat milk, choosing prepared foods with lower sodium, and drinking water instead of sugary drinks. For more details on healthy eating, check out the ChooseMyPlate.gov site, especially the link with the detailed dietary guidelines for Americans 2010. Did you ever worry as you were eating a triple dip cone from or of premium ice cream that you really should be eating fat-free frozen yogurt instead? If so, you are among the people who have taken to heart literally the link between diet and cardiovascular disease. The American Heart Association makes it clear that foods high in saturated fat, such as our beloved ice cream, should be replaced with foods low in fat, such as fat-free frozen yogurt. The main goal of these recommendations is to lower your level of cholesterol, because high cholesterol is one risk factor for cardiovascular disease. There is an important difference between the two types of cholesterol, which are defined by their effect on blood flow. Lipoproteins are fatty chemicals attached to proteins carried in blood. LDLs cause fatty deposits to accumulate in arteries, impeding blood flow, whereas HDLs help keep arteries clear and break down LDLs. It is not so much the overall cholesterol number, but the ratio of LDL to HDL that matters most in cholesterol screening. High levels of LDL are a risk factor for cardiovascular disease, and high levels of HDL are considered a protective factor. Reducing LDL levels is effective in diminishing the risk of cardiovascular disease of adults of all ages. In healthy adults, a high level of LDL, which it would be over 160 milligrams per deciliter, indicates a higher risk of cardiovascular disease. In contrast, higher levels of HDL are good. In healthy adults, levels of at least 40 milligrams per deciliter for men and 50 milligrams per deciliter for women. LDL levels can be lowered and HDL levels can be raised through various interventions such as exercise and a high fiber diet. Weight control is also an important component. Numerous medications exist for treatment of cholesterol problems. The most popular of these drugs are from a family of medications called statins, for example, Lipitor and Zocor. These medications lower LDL and moderately increase HDL. Because of potential side effects on liver functioning, patients taking cholesterol-lowering medications should be monitored on a regular basis. Obesity is a growing health problem related to diet. One good way to assess your own status is to compute your BMI. BMI is a ratio of body weight to height and is related to total body fat. You can compute BMI as follows. BMI is equal to the weight divided by the height squared, where W equals weight in kilograms or weight in pounds divided by 2.2, and height is equal to your height in meters or inches divided by 39.37. The National Institutes of Health and the American Heart Association define healthy weight as having a BMI of less than 25. However, this calculation may overestimate body fat in very muscular people and underestimate body fat in those who appear of normal weight but have little muscle mass. Body mass index is related to the risk of serious medical conditions and mortality. The higher one's BMI, the higher one's risk. The figure shows the increased risk for several diseases and mortality associated with increased BMI. Based on these estimates, You may want to lower your BMI if it's above 25, but be careful. Lowering your BMI too much may not be healthy either. Extremely low BMIs may indicate malnutrition, which is also related to increased mortality. Social, gender, and ethnic issues in health. We have indicated that although most young adults are healthy, there are important individual differences. Let's see what they are. The two most important social influences on health are socioeconomic status, which is a strong predictor of whether a person has access to insurance and good health care, and education, a good predictor of living a healthy lifestyle and avoiding certain diseases. In the United States, regardless of ethnic group, people who live in poverty are more likely to be poor health than people who do not. In the United States, the worst health conditions exist in poor inner city neighborhoods. For example, African American men in large urban areas have a lower life expectancy than men in some developing countries. Many inner city residents rely on overcrowded clinics. Why is this the case? The main reason is poverty. As noted earlier, poverty is associated with inadequate health care, higher rates of chronic disease, and higher mortality throughout life in many countries. Even when poor minorities in the United States have access to health care, they are less likely than European Americans to receive treatment for chronic disease. College graduates are less likely to develop chronic diseases such as hypertension and cardiovascular disease than people who do not go to college. In fact, people who have less education are not only more likely to contract a chronic disease, they are also more likely to die from it. In one of the largest studies examining this issue ever conducted, results show that in a representative sample of 5,652 working adults between the ages of 18 and 64, educational level was associated with good health even when the effects of age, gender, ethnicity, and smoking were accounted for. This is also true when looking at specific conditions such as rheumatoid arthritis. Does education cause good health? Not exactly. As we discussed in Chapter 1, correlation research does not address cause and effect. In this case, higher educational level is also associated with higher income and also with more awareness of dietary and lifestyle influences on health. Thus, more highly educated people are in a better position to afford health care and to know about the kinds of foods and lifestyle that affect health. Are men or women healthier? This question is difficult to answer, primarily because women were not routinely included in many major studies of health in the United States until the 1990s. However, there are several clear gender differences. Women live longer than men on average, for reasons described in Chapter 14, and young adult males are more likely to die from homicide than are young adult females. Internationally, gender differences matter. As the World Health Organization points out, in some parts of the world, women cannot receive health care they need because cultural norms prohibit women from traveling alone to a clinic, or men have much higher rates of lung cancer because smoking is considered a marker of masculinity. 10.3 Cognitive Development. What is intelligence in adulthood? These are the learning objectives. What are the primary and secondary mental abilities and how do they change? What are fluid and crystallized intelligence and how do they change? How has neuroscience research furthered our understanding of intelligence in adulthood? What is post-formal thought and how does it differ from formal operations? And last, how do emotion and logic become integrated in adulthood? Susan, a 33-year-old woman recently laid off from her job as a secretary, slides into her seat on her first day of classes at the community college. She is clearly nervous. I'm worried that I won't be able to compete with the younger students, that I may not be smart enough. She sighs. Guess we'll find out soon enough though, huh? Many returning adult students like Susan worry that they may not be, quote, smart enough to keep up with 18 or 19-year-olds. Are these fears realistic? In this section, we'll examine the evidence concerning intellectual performance in adulthood. We will see how the answer to this question depends on the types of intellectual skills being used. How should we view intelligence in adults? We interrupt this section for a brief exercise. Take a sheet of paper and write down all the abilities that you think reflect intelligence in adults. When you have finished, read further to see how these items on your list match research results. It's a safe bet that you listed more than one ability as reflecting adults' intelligence. You are not alone. Most theories of intelligence are multidimensional. That is, they identify several types of intelligence or intellectual abilities. As discussed in Chapter 6, there is disagreement about the number and types of abilities, but nearly everyone agrees that no single generic type of intelligence is responsible for all the different kinds of mental activities we perform. Sternberg emphasized multidimensionality in his theory of successful intelligence. Based on lifespan perspective, Baltes and colleagues introduced three other concepts as vital to intellectual development in adults: multidirectionality, interindividual variability, and plasticity. Let's look at each of these concepts in turn. Over time, the various abilities underlying adults' intelligence show multidirectionality. Some aspects of intelligence improve and other aspects decline during adulthood. Closely related to this is interindividual variability. These patterns of change also vary from one person to another. In the next two sections, we will see evidence for both multidirectionality and interindividual variability when we examine developmental trends for specific sets of intellectual abilities. Finally, people's abilities reflect plasticity. They are not fixed but can be modified under the right conditions just about any point in adulthood. Because most research on plasticity has focused on older adults, we return to the topic in Chapter 14. In general, Baltes and colleagues emphasize that intelligence has many components and that these components show varying development in different abilities and different people. Given that intelligence in adults is complex and multifaceted construct, how might we study it? Two common ways involve administering formal testing and assessing practical problem-solving skills. Formal testing assesses a wide range of abilities and involves tests from which we can compute overall IQ scores like those discussed in Chapter 6. Tests of practical problem solving assess people's ability to apply intellectual skills to everyday situations. Let's see how each approach describes intellectual development. Primary and secondary mental abilities. We know that intelligence consists of many different skills and abilities. Since the 1930s, researchers have agreed that intellectual abilities can be studied as groups of related skills, such as memory or spatial ability, organized into hypothetical constructs called primary mental abilities. In turn, related groups of primary mental abilities can be clustered into a half dozen or so broader skills termed secondary abilities. Roughly 25 primary mental abilities have been identified. Because it is difficult to study all of them, researchers have focused on 5 representative ones. These would be number, word fluency, verbal meaning, inductive reasoning, and spatial orientation. So number. The basic skills underlying our mathematical reasoning. Word fluency, how easily we produce verbal descriptions of things. Verbal meaning, our vocabulary ability. Inductive reasoning, our ability to extrapolate from particular facts to general concepts. Spatial orientation, our ability to reason in the three-dimensional world. Do these primary abilities change across adulthood? The answers in the Spotlight on Research feature. Even with a relatively small number of primary mental abilities, though, it is still hard to discuss intelligence by focusing on separate abilities. As a result, theories of intelligence tend to emphasize clusters of related primary mental abilities as a framework for describing the structure of intelligence. Because they are one step removed from primary mental abilities, however, secondary mental abilities are not measured directly. This can be seen in the figure. This can be seen in the figure for the secondary mental abilities that we will consider next, fluid and crystallized intelligence. Fluid and crystallized intelligence. 2 secondary mental abilities have received a great deal of attention in adult developmental research: fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence consists of the abilities that make you flexible and adaptive thinker, that allow you to make inferences, and that enable you to understand the relations among concepts. It includes the abilities you need to understand and respond to any situation, but especially new ones: inductive reasoning, integration, abstract thinking, and the like. An example of a question that taps fluid abilities is reasoning the following: what letter comes next in the series D, F, I, M, R, X, E? Other typical ways of testing fluid intelligence include mazes, puzzles, and relations among shapes. These tests are usually timed, and higher scores are associated with faster solutions. Crystallized intelligence is the knowledge you have acquired through life experience and education in a particular culture. Crystallized intelligence includes your breadth of knowledge, comprehension of communication, judgment, and sophistication with information. Your ability to remember historical facts, definitions of words, knowledge of literature, and sports trivia information are some examples. Many popular television game shows, such as Jeopardy or Wheel of Fortune, are based on contestants' accumulated crystallized intelligence. Even though crystallized intelligence involves cultural knowledge, it is based partly on the quality of a person's underlying fluid intelligence. For example, the breadth of your vocabulary depends to some extent on how quickly you are able to make connections between new words you read and information already known, which is a component of fluid intelligence. Developmentally, fluid and crystallized intelligence follow two very different paths, as you can see in the figure. Notice the fluid intelligence declines throughout adulthood, whereas crystallized intelligence improves. Although we do not yet fully understand why fluid intelligence declines, it may be related to underlying changes in brain the brain from the accumulated effects of disease, injury, and aging, or from lack of practice. In contrast, the increase in crystallized intelligence, at least until late life, indicates that people continue adding knowledge every day. What do these different developmental trends imply? First, they indicate that although it continues throughout adulthood, learning becomes more difficult with age. Consider what happens when Michael, age 17, and Marge, age 50, learn a second language. Although Marge's verbal skills in her native language, a component of crystallized intelligence, are probably better than Michael's, his probable superiority in the fluid abilities necessary to learn another language will usually make it easier for him to do so. Second, these developmental trends point out once again that intellectual development varies a great deal from one set of skills to another. Beyond the differences in overall trends, differences in individuals' fluid and crystallized intelligence also vary. Whereas individual differences in fluid intelligence remain relatively uniform, over time, individual differences in crystallized intelligence increase with age, largely because maintaining crystallized intelligence depends on being in situations that require its use. For example, few adults get much practice in solving complex letter series tasks like the one on page 366. But because people can improve their vocabulary skills by reading, and because people differ considerably in how much they read, differences are likely to emerge. In short, crystallized intelligence promotes a rich knowledge base to draw on when material is somewhat familiar, whereas fluid intelligence provides the power to deal with learning in novel situations. Neuroscience research and intelligence in young and middle adulthood. Intellectual abilities have long been known to correlate with mortality in late life, but evidence is now increasing that the relation also holds in middle age. In a longitudinal study of nearly 995,000 young adult male military recruits in Sweden, Batty and colleagues showed that higher intelligence at the time these men enlisted was related to lower mortality from accidents, coronary heart disease, and suicide in middle age. Similarly, changes in specific mental abilities related to memory predicted mortality in middle age in a study of more than 10,000 workers in Britain. Recent advances in neuroscience have provided additional insights into these predictive relations. Research aimed at identifying neurobiological factors such as continued maturation of the frontal cortex in young adulthood has resulted in greater understanding of intellectual development. Considered together, this research suggests that specific areas in the brain are associated with intellectual abilities and that developmental changes in these areas should be related to changes in performance. Indeed, this appears to be the case. On the basis of 37 studies using various brain imaging techniques, Young and Hare proposed the parieto-frontal integration theory. Parieto-frontal integration theory, or PFIT, proposes that intelligence comes from a distributed and integrated network of neurons in the parietal and frontal lobes of the brain. The parietal lobe is at the top of the head. The frontal lobe is behind the forehead. In general, PFIT accounts for individual differences in intelligence as having their origins in individual differences in brain structure and function. PFIT model has been tested in several studies. Results indicate support for the theory when measures of fluid, crystallized, and spatial intelligence are related to brain structures assessed in young adults through MRI. It is also clear that performance on measures of specific abilities are likely related to specific combinations of brain structures. The research from a neuroscience approach is likely to provide insight into another current controversy regarding when cognitive decline begins in adulthood. Salthouse claims that such declines actually begin in the 20s for many abilities. His argument was based mainly on issues related to a problem with longitudinal research designs discussed in Chapter 1, the effects of repeated testing. Salthouse shows that once retesting effects are measured, evidence for decline in young adulthood becomes apparent. Others disagree. Seiche argues that Salthouse's claims are based on incorrect conclusions regarding research designs. Perhaps focused research using tools of neuroscience, like brain imaging, will be able to sort through this controversy. By continuing to map changes in specific brain structures and their relation to particular changes in intellectual abilities, we will be able to determine definitively when cognitive decline actually begins. Going beyond formal operations, thinking about adulthood. Suppose you are faced with the following dilemma. You are a member of your college's or university's student judicial board and are currently hearing a case involving plagiarism. The student handbook states that plagiarism is a serious offense that results in expulsion. The student accused of plagiarizing a paper admits copying from Wikipedia, but says that she has never been told that she needed to use a formal citation and quotation marks. Do you vote to expel the student? When this and similar problems are presented to older adolescents and young adults, interesting differences emerge. Adolescents tend to point out that the student handbook is clear and the student ignored it, concluding that the student should be expelled. Adolescents thus tend to approach the problem in formal operational terms, as discussed in Chapter 6. They reason deductively from the information given to come to a single solution grounded in their own experience. Formal operational thinkers are certain that such solutions are right because they are based on their own experience and are logically driven. But many adults are reluctant to draw conclusions based on limited information in this problem, especially when the problem can be interpreted in different ways. They point out that there is much about the student we don't know. Has she ever been taught the proper procedure for using sources? Was the faculty member clear about what plagiarism is? For adults, the problem is much more ambiguous. Adults may eventually decide that the student is or is not expelled, but they do so only after considering aspects of the situation that go well beyond the information given in the problem. Such thinking shows a recognition that other people's experiences may be quite different from one's own. Clearly, the thought process these adults use is different from the formal operations. Unlike formal operational thinking, this approach involves considering situational constraints and circumstances, realizing that the reality sometimes constrains solutions, and knowing that feelings matter. Perry first uncovered adults' different thinking and traced its development. He found that 18-year-old first-year college students tend to rely heavily on expertise of authority figures. For example, experts, professors, police, parents, to determine which ways of thinking are right and which are wrong. For these students, thinking is tightly tied to logic, as Piaget had argued, and the only legitimate answers are ones that are logically derived. Perceptions change over the next few years. Students go through a phase in which they are much less sure of which answers are right, or whether there are any right answers at all. However, by the time they are ready to graduate, students are fairly adept at examining different sides of an issue and have developed commitments to particular viewpoints. Students recognize that they are the source of their own authority, that they must take a position on an issue, and that other people may hold different positions from theirs but be equally committed. During the college years, then, individuals become able to understand many perspectives on an issue, choose one, and still acknowledge the right of others to hold differing views. Perry concluded that this kind of thinking is very different from formal operations and represents another level of cognitive development. Based on several additional longitudinal studies of numerous cross-sectional investigations, researchers concluded that this type of thinking represents a qualitative change beyond formal operations. Post-formal thought is characterized by a recognition that truth, the correct answer, may vary from situation to situation, that solutions must be realistic to be reasonable, that ambiguity and contradiction are the rule rather than the exception, and that emotion and subjective factors usually play a role in thinking. In general, the research evidence indicates that post-formal thinking has its origins in young adulthood. Several research-based descriptions of the development of thinking in adulthood have been offered. One of the best is the description of the development of reflective judgment, a way in which adults reason through dilemmas involving current affairs, religion, science, personal relationships, and the like. Based on decades of longitudinal and cross-sectional research, Kitchener and King refined descriptions and identified a systematic progression of reflective judgment in young adulthood, which is described in the table. So table 10.1 is titled Description of Stages of Reflective Judgment. The stages are pre-reflective reasoning, which is stages 1 through 3. There's quasi-reflective reasoning, which is stages 4 and 5. And then there's reflective reasoning, which is stages 6 and 7. So pre-reflective reasoning, the description here is belief that, quote, knowledge is gained through the word of an authority figure or through first-hand observation rather than, for example, through the evaluation of evidence. People who hold these assumptions believe that they know what they know is absolutely correct and that they know with complete certainty. People who hold these assumptions treat all problems as though they were well structured. An example statement typical of stages 1 through 3 is, quote, I know it because I see it. Or, quote, if it's on Fox News, it must be true. Next stage is quasi-reflective reasoning, which are stages 4 and 5. Here's the description. Recognition, quote, that knowledge, or more accurately, knowledge claims, contain elements of uncertainty which people who hold these assumptions attribute to missing information or to methods of obtaining the evidence. Although they use evidence, they do not understand how evidence entails a conclusion, especially in light of the acknowledged uncertainty, and thus tend to view judgments as highly idiosyncratic. Example statements typical of stage 4 and 5 are, quote, I would believe in climate change if I could see the proof. How can you be sure the scientists aren't just making up the data? The last stage, reflective reasoning, which is stages 6 and 7. Here's the description. People who hold these assumptions accept, quote, the knowledge claims cannot be made with certainty, but they are not immobilized by it. Rather, they make judgments that are most reasonable and about which they are relatively certain based on their evaluation of available data. They believe they must actively construct their decisions and that knowledge claims must be evaluated in relationship to the context in which they were generated to determine their validity. They also readily admit their willingness to reevaluate the adequacy of their judgments as new data or new methodologies become available. Examples, statements typical of stages 6 and 7 are, quote, it is difficult to be certain about things in life, but you can draw your own conclusions about them based on how well an argument is put together based on the data used to support it. So back to the reading. The first three stages in the model represent pre-reflective thought. People in these stages typically do not acknowledge and may not even perceive that knowledge is uncertain. Consequently, they do not understand that some problems exist for which there is not a clear and absolutely correct answer. A student pressuring her instructor for the, quote, right theory to explain human development reflects this stage. She is also likely to hold firm positions on controversial issues and does so without acknowledging other people's ability to reach different but nevertheless equally logical positions. About halfway through the developmental progression, students think very differently. In stages 4 and 5, students are likely to say that nothing can be known for certain and to change their conclusions based on the situation and the evidence. At this point, students argue that knowledge is quite subjective. They are also less persuasive in their positions on controversial issues. Each person is entitled to his or her own view. I cannot force my opinions on anyone else. Kitchener and King refer to thinking in these stages as, quote, quasi-reflective thinking. As students continue their development into stage 6 and 7, they begin to show true reflective judgment, understanding that people construct knowledge using evidence and argument after careful analysis of the problem or situation. They once again hold firm convictions, but reach them only after careful consideration of several points of view. They also realize that they must continually reevaluate their beliefs in view of new evidence. Efforts at using the reflective judgment model to shape classroom and education are becoming common. For example, teacher training programs and examination practices have been adapted using the reflective judgment model as guidance. Even though people are able to think at very complex levels, do they? Not usually. Why is this the case? Mostly it is because the environment does not provide the supports necessary for using one's highest level thinking, especially for issues concerning knowledge and expertise you already have. For example, people must not always purchase the product that has the least impact on the environment, such as a fully electric car, even though philosophically they are strong environmentalists, because recharging stations are currently not widely available. However, if pushed and if given the necessary supports, for example, easily available charging stations, people demonstrate a level of thinking and performance far higher than they typically show on a daily basis. This discrepancy may explain why fewer people are at each more complex level of thinking consistently employ that level of thought. In sum, research on post-formal thinking shows that many adults progress from believing in a single right way of thinking and acting to accepting the existence of multiple solutions, each potentially equally acceptable or equally flawed. This progression is important. It allows for the integration of emotion with thought in dealing with practical everyday problems, as we will see next. Integrating emotion and logic in life problems. You may have noticed that a hallmark of post-formal thinking is the movement from thinking, quote, I am right because I've experienced it, to, quote, I'm not sure who's right because your experience is different from mine. Problem situations that had seemed pretty straightforward in adolescence appear more complicated to young adults. The, quote, right thing to do is much tougher to figure out. Differences in thinking styles have major implications for dealing with life problems. For example, couples who are able to understand and synthesize each other's points of view are much more likely to resolve conflicts. Couples not able to do so are more likely to feel resentful, adrift, or even break up. In addition to an increased understanding that there is more than one, quote, right answer, adult thinking is characterized by integration of emotion with logic. Beginning in young adulthood and continuing through middle age, people gradually shift from an orientation emphasizing conformity and context-free principles to one emphasizing change and context-dependent principles. As they mature, adults tend to make decisions and analyze problems not so much on logical grounds as on pragmatic and emotional grounds. Rules and norms are viewed as relative, not absolute. Mature thinkers realize that thinking is an inherently social enterprise that demands making compromises with other people and tolerating contradiction and ambiguity. Such shifts mean that one's sense of self also undergoes a fundamental change. A good example of this developmental shift would be the differences between how late adolescents or young adults view an emotionally charged issue, such as unethical behavior at work, compared to views of middle-aged adults. Younger people may view such behavior as completely inexcusable, with firing of the employee as an inescapable outcome. Middle-aged adults may take contextual factors into account and consider what factors may have forced the person to engage in the behavior. Some might argue that this is because the topic is too emotionally charged for adolescents to deal with intellectually, whereas young adults are better able to incorporate emotion into their thinking. But is this interpretation reasonable? It appears to be. In a now classic study, high school students, college students, and middle-aged adults were given 3 dilemmas to resolve. One dilemma had low emotional involvement and concerned conflicting accounts of a war between 2 fictitious countries, written by a partisan from each country. The other two dilemmas had high emotional involvement. In one, parents and their adolescent son disagreed about going to visit the grandparents. The son did not want to go. In the other, a man and a woman had to resolve an unintentional pregnancy. The man was anti-abortion, the woman was pro-choice. The results are shown in the figure. You should note two important findings. First, there were clear developmental trends in reasoning level, with the middle-aged adults best able to integrate emotion into thinking. Second, the high school and college students were equivalent on the fictitious war dilemma, but the young adult students more readily integrated emotions and thought on the visit and pregnancy dilemmas. These results support the kinds of developmental shifts suggested by Lebouvier, Vieff, and colleagues. To continue the earlier example, dealing with an unethical coworker may require the integration of thought and emotion, which is done better by young and best by middle-aged adults. The mounting evidence of continued cognitive development in adulthood paints a more positive view of adulthood than that of Piaget, who focused only on logical thinking. The integration of emotion and logic that happens in adulthood provides the basis for decision making in the very personal and sometimes difficult arenas of love and work, which we examine in detail in chapters 11 and 12, respectively. In the present context, it sets the stage for envisioning one's future life, a topic we take up later in this chapter. Implicit social beliefs. The developmental integration of thought and emotion during young adulthood and middle age turns out to be influenced by life cycle forces and cohort effects. How strongly do people hold beliefs may vary as a function of how particular generations were socialized. For example, although many adults of all ages may believe that couples should not live together before marriage, older generations may be more adamant in this belief. Social cognition researchers argue that individual differences in the strength of social representations of rules, beliefs, and attitudes are linked to specific situations. Such representations can be both cognitive, which is how we think about the situation, and emotional, how we react to the situation. When we encounter a specific situation, our cognitive belief system triggers an emotional reaction and related goals tied to this content of the situation, which demands integration of cognition and emotion. This, in turn, drives social judgments. To see how this works, consider the belief that couples should not live together before marriage. If you were socialized from childhood to believe in this rule, then you would likely evaluate anyone violating the rule negatively. For example, suppose you were told about a man named Alan who urged Joan to live with him before they were married. They subsequently broke up. You may have a negative emotional response and blame Alan for the breakup because he pressured Joan to cohabit. Research exploring social beliefs finds age differences in the types of social rules and evaluations evoked in different types of situations. For example, when participants considered a husband who chooses to work long hours instead of spend more time with his wife and children, different evaluations about the husband and the marriage emerged. The belief that, quote, marriage is more important than a career tended to increase the importance with age. As can be seen in the figure, this was particularly evident from age 24 to age 65. The social inverted U-shape graph, adults between age 30 and 55 were most likely to give this evaluation. When the research question involved a young couple who eloped despite their parents' objections, the social evaluations, quote, parents should have talked to, not provoked the young couple, and, quote, they were too young, also exhibited an inverted U-shaped relationship with age. In other words, middle-aged people endorsed these rules, whereas younger and older people did not. On the other hand, you, quote, can't stop true love showed the U-shaped relationship with age. That is, younger and older age groups endorsed this rule while middle-aged people did not. It may be that between ages 30 and 45, people are not focusing mainly on issues of true love. This makes sense because they are likely at the stage of life where building a career is more important. Those in this age group also emphasized the pragmatics of age, for example, being too young, as an important factor in marriage decisions. One possible explanation for these findings is that cohort effects or generational differences influenced whether strong family social rules would be activated. This is how cognition and emotion interact. Alternatively, the results could also reflect issues concerning different life stages of the respondents. For example, the pressures of providing for children may influence how one responds in midlife more so than in early or late adulthood. In any case, social beliefs as expressed through social rules and evaluations are a powerful influence on how we behave in everyday life. Either way, the developmental shift in integration of cognition and emotion is an important determinant of age differences in social problem solving. (10.4) 10.4 Who do you want to be? Personality in young adulthood. Learning objectives. What is the lifespan construct? How do adults create scenarios and life stories? What are possible selves? Do they show differences during adulthood? What are personal control beliefs? Felicia is a 19-year-old sophomore at a community college. She expects her study of early childhood education to be difficult but rewarding. She figures that along the way she will meet a great guy whom she will marry soon after graduation. They will have 2 children before she turns 30. Felicia sees herself getting a good job teaching preschool children and someday owning her own daycare center. In Chapter 9, we saw how children and adolescents deal with the question, quote, what do you want to be when you grow up? As a young adult, Felicia has arrived at the grown-up part and is experimenting with some idealistic answers to the question. Are Felicia's answers typical of most young adults? In this section, we will examine how the search for identity gets transformed through the cognitive, social, and personal reality of adulthood. As a result, people create life scenarios and life stories, possible selves, self-concept, and personal control beliefs. Let's begin by considering how Felicia and the rest of us construct images of our adult lives. Creating scenarios and life stories. Figuring out what and who you want to be as an adult takes lots of thought, hard work, and time. Based on personal experience and input from other people, young adults create a lifespan construct that represents a unified sense of past, present, and future. Several factors influence the development of a lifespan construct. Identity, values, and society are only a few. Together, they not only shape the creation of the lifespan construct, but also influence the way it is played out and whether it remains stable. The lifespan construct represents a link between Erikson's notion of identity, which is a major focus during adolescence, and our adult view of ourselves. The first way the lifespan construct is manifested is through the scenario, which consists of expectations about the future. The scenario takes aspects of a person's identity that are particularly important now and projects them into a plan for the future. For example, you may find yourself thinking about the day you will graduate and be able to apply all the knowledge and skills you've learned. In short, a scenario is a game plan for how your life will play out in the future. Felicia, the sophomore human development student, has a fairly typical scenario. She plans on completing a degree in early childhood education, marrying after graduation, and having 2 children by age 30. Tagging future events with a particular time or age by which they are to be completed creates a social clock. This may use biological markers of time, such as menopause, social aspects of time, such as getting married, and historical time, such as the turn of the century. Felicia will use her scenario to evaluate progress toward her personal goals. With each new event, she will check where she is against where her scenario says she should be. If she's ahead of her plan, she may be proud of having made it. If she's lagging behind, she may chastise herself for being slow. But if she criticizes herself too much, she may change her scenario altogether. For example, if she does not go to college, she may decide to change her career goals entirely. Instead of owning her own daycare center, she may aim to be a manager in a department store. McAdams' life story model. McAdams argues that a person's sense of identity cannot be understood based on traits or personal concerns. To him, identity is not just a collection of traits, nor is it a collection of plans, strategies, or goals. Instead, it is based on the story of how each person came into being, where she has been, where she is going, and who she will become. One's life story is a personal narrative that organizes past events into a coherent sequence. Our life story becomes our autobiography as we move through adulthood. McAdams believes that people create a life story that is an internalized narrative with a beginning, a middle, and an anticipated end. You write your life story in young adulthood and revise it throughout the rest of your life as you change and as the changing environment places different demands on you. McAdams and colleagues' research indicates that people in Western society begin forming their life story in late adolescence and early adulthood, but the story has its roots in the development of one's earliest attachments in infancy. As in Erikson's theory, adolescence marks the full initiation into forming an identity, and thus a coherent life story begins there. In early adulthood, it is continued and refined, and from midlife and beyond, the story is refashioned in the wake of major and minor life changes. Generativity marks the attempt to create an appealing story ending that will yield new beginnings for future generations. Paramount to these life stories is the changing personal identity reflected in the emotions conveyed in the story, from tragedy to optimism or through comic and romantic descriptions. In addition, motivations change and are reflected in the person repeatedly trying to attain his or her goals over time. The two most common goal themes are agency, reflecting power, achievement, and autonomy, and communication, or communion, reflecting love, intimacy, and belongingness. Finally, stories indicate beliefs and values, or the ideology that the person uses to set the context for his or her actions. Every life story contains episodes that provide insight into perceived change and continuity in life. People prove to themselves and to others that they have either changed or remained the same by pointing to specific events that support the appropriate claim. The main characteristics in people's lives represent idealizations of the self, such as, quote, the dutiful mother or, quote, the reliable worker. Integrating these various aspects of self is a major challenge of midlife and later adulthood. Finally, all life stories need an ending through which the self is able to leave a legacy that creates new beginnings. Life stories in middle-aged and older adults have a clear quality of, quote, giving birth to a new generation, a notion essentially identical to generativity. One popular method for examining the development of life stories is autobiographical memory. When people tell their life story to others, it is a joint product of the speaker and the audience. Pasupathy and colleagues report that connections between the self and events create a stable sense of self and of how one changes over time. Additionally, the responses of the audience affect how the teller remembers his or her experiences. For example, if listeners find a particular experience interesting, then the person who shared that memory will likely tell it again, but without positive listener feedback, this is less likely. This is a good example of conversational remembering, much like collaborative cognition discussed in Chapter 9. Overall, McAdams believes identity change over time is a process of fashioning and refashioning one's life story. This process appears to be strongly influenced by culture. At times, the reformulation may be at a conscious level, such as when people make explicit decisions about changing careers. At other times, the revision process is unconscious and implicit, growing out of everyday activities. The goal is to create a life story that is coherent, credible, open to new possibilities, richly differentiated, able to reconcile opposing aspects of oneself, and integrated with the sociocultural context. Possible selves. When we are asked questions like, quote, what do you think you'll be like in a few years from now, it requires us to imagine ourselves in the future. When we speculate like this, we create a possible self. Possible selves represent what we could become, what we would like to become, and what we are afraid of becoming. What we could or would like to become often reflects personal goals. We may see ourselves as leaders, as rich and famous, or as in shape. What we are afraid of becoming may show up in our fear of being alone, or overweight, or unsuccessful. Our possible selves are powerful motivators. Indeed, how we behave is largely an effort to achieve or avoid these various possible selves and to protect the current view of self. The topic of possible selves offers a way to understand how both stability and change operate in adults' personality. On one hand, possible selves tend to remain stable for at least some period of time and are measurable with psychometrically sound scales. On the other hand, possible selves may change in response to efforts directed towards personal growth, which would be expected from ego development theory. In particular, possible selves facilitate adaptation to new roles across the lifespan. For example, a full-time mother who pictures herself as an executive once her child goes to school may enroll in evening courses to acquire new skills. Thus, possible selves offer a way to bridge the experience of the current self and our imagined future self. Researchers have examined age differences in construction of possible selves. In a rare set of familiar studies conducted across time in research teams by Cross and Marcus and Hooker and colleagues, people across the adult lifespan were asked to describe their hope for and feared possible selves. The responses were grouped into categories. For example, family, personal, material, relationships, occupation. Several interesting age differences emerged. In terms of hoped for selves, young adults listed family concerns, for instance, marrying the right person, as most important. And Hooker and colleagues found that getting started in an occupation was also important for this age group. In contrast, adults in their 30s listed family concerns last their main issue involved personal concerns, such as being more loving and caring of a person. By ages 40 to 59, Cross and Marcus found that family issues again became most common. For example, being a parent who can, quote, let go of the children. Hooker and Kaus also found that reaching and maintaining satisfactory performance in one's occupational career, as well as accepting and adjusting to psychological changes of middle age, were important to this age group. As shown in the figure, health becomes an increasingly important factor in defining the self as people grow older. Both sets of studies found that for the two younger groups, being overweight for women, becoming wrinkled and unattractive when old, were commonly mentioned as feared for selves. For middle-aged and older adult groups, fear of having Alzheimer's disease or being unable to care for oneself were frequent responses. For adults over 60, researchers find that personal issues are most prominent. For example, being active and healthy for at least another decade. Similarly, Hooker and colleagues found that continuity in possible selves was much more prevalent than change in later life, especially in regard to independence and physical and lifestyle areas. However, they also found that change did occur in older age. The greatest amount of change occurred in the health domain, which predominated the hoped for and feared for selves. The health domain is most sensitive and central to self in the context of aging, and people's possible self related to health is quite resilient in the face of health challenges in later life. Overall, young adults have multiple possible selves and believe that they can actually become the hoped for self and successfully avoid the feared self. Their outlook tends to be quite positive. Life experience may dampen this outlook. By old age, both the number of possible selves and strength of belief have decreased. Older adults are more likely to believe that neither the hoped for nor the feared self is under their personal control. These findings may reflect differences with age in personal motivation, beliefs in personal control, and the need to explore new options. Other researchers have examined possible selves in a different way by asking adults to describe their present, past, future, and ideal self. Instead of examining categories of possible selves, this approach focuses on people's perceptions of change over time. The data indicate that young and middle-aged adults see themselves as improving with age and expecting to continue getting better in the future, sometimes unrealistically so. By the time people reach old age, they see themselves as having remained stable over time, but foresee decline in the future. The findings suggest that the older group has internalized negative stereotypes about aging. Personal control beliefs. Do you feel you have control over your life? Personal control beliefs reflect the degree to which you believe your performance in a situation depends on something you do. For example, suppose you are not offered a job when you think you should have been. Was it your fault? Or was it because the company was too short-sighted to recognize your true talent? Which option you select provides insight into a general tendency. Do you generally believe that outcomes depend on the things you do? Or are they due to factors outside of yourself, such as luck or the power of others? A high sense of personal control implies a belief that performance is up to you, whereas a low sense of personal control implies that your performance is under the influence of forces other than your own. Personal control is an extremely important idea in a wide variety of settings and cultures because of the way it guides behavior. Successful people like Stephanie Joanne Angela Germanotta, better known as Lady Gaga, need to exude a high sense of personal control in order to demonstrate that they are in charge. Personal control is an important concept that can be applied broadly to several domains, including social networks, health, and careers. For example, personal control beliefs are important not only in personality development, but also, as we'll see in chapter 14, in memory performance in late life. Research indicates that people experience 4 types of personal control: control from within oneself, control over oneself, and control over the environment, and control from the environment. Despite its importance, we do not have a clear picture of the developmental course of personal control beliefs. Evidence from both cross-sectional and longitudinal studies is contradictory. Some data indicate that younger adults are less likely to hold internal control beliefs, for example, believing they are in control of outcomes, than older adults. Other research finds the opposite. The contradiction may derive from the complex nature of personal control beliefs in the context of the situation. These beliefs vary depending on which domain, such as intelligence or health, is being assessed. Indeed, other research shows that perceived control over one's development declines with age, whereas perceived control over marital happiness increases. Additionally, younger adults are more satisfied when attributing success in attaining a goal to their own efforts, whereas older adults are more satisfied when they attribute such success to their ability. Clearly, people of all ages and cultures try to influence their environment regardless of whether they believe they will be successful. Heckhausen, Warrosh, and Scholes pulled together the various perspectives on control beliefs and proposed a motivational theory of lifespan development to describe how people optimize primary and secondary control. Primary control is behavior aimed at affecting the individual's external world. Working a second job to increase one's earnings is an example. One's ability to influence the environment is heavily influenced by biological factors, for example, stamina to work 2 jobs. So it changes over time from very low influence during early childhood to high influence during middle age and then to very low again in late life. Secondary control is behavior or cognition aimed at affecting the individual's internal world. An example is believing that one is capable of success even when faced with challenges. The developmental patterns of both types of control are shown in the figure. The figure also shows that people of all ages strive to control their environment, but how they do this changes over time. Note that for the first half of life, primary and secondary control operate in parallel. During midlife, primary control begins to decline, but secondary control does not. Thus, the desire to control does not change. What differs with age is whether we can actually affect our environment or whether we need to think about things differently.